Alright, sorry, this episode's going to be a little out of sync since I'll be doing this one in post-commentary. I had a little issue with a new microphone I bought, and it turned out it was picking up all the music that was overflowing out of my headphones, and it kind of ruined the audio track. So I'm going to try to go step by step back through this as evenly as I can. So in our last episode, we'd implemented the NPC dialog using the Dialogger plugin available in the Unity Asset Store. And this time, we're coming back in here, and we are going to add some conditional statements to kind of change the dialogue, make it a little bit more fluid. Just still testing out features of this particular plugin. So I think at this point in the video, I was kind of, doing the same thing, going back over and describing, what we were doing in our last part. And you'll see here, if you remember from last time, our Dialogger interface has, on the left, it's got a set of essentially conversations. And in the center is the designer where we set up the flow diagram for how the conversation proceeds. And I've just brought up the variable editor, which has both local and global variables that can be added and edited within it. A global variable in the context of Dialogger is one that can be set from outside of the editor, and it persists for longer than the current conversation. A local variable is a variable that exists only in this particular conversation with this particular... So within this NPC1 scope, you would have local variables, and those might represent choices that are made by the player that don't really need to be persisted later on. Similarly, global variables get persisted and or serialized to XML format, and they can be loaded back in afterwards, so you can keep those associated with your save file. And I think at this point I was just pointing out that this dialog that comes up is a little janky. So it's got a few toggles that come up, and you choose, you see that true false down there where we're, essentially just toggling what the default value of the variable is. And we'll see some more examples of that type of UI once we get to setting the conditional statement within the dialog. Yeah, so for the first step, we're coming back in here. We're going to add a single condition for whether or not the NPC has been spoken to before or not. And if it's the first time talking to the NPC, we're going to display one set of dialogue. And if it is one of the subsequent times, we're going to have a different bit of dialogue come up. So we're setting our conditional statement here. And you can see these buttons for equals and not equals are both toggles. So you choose one or the other. And true or false is the evaluation of the condition. I didn't really look at it in this part, but I'm assuming if we choose a float or a string variable, there's a entry in there for us to enter the value to compare to in the conversation. Now we're going to add our second bit of text here. Now, sadly, this editor doesn't seem to have anything as far as good formatting, like pixel snapping or anything like that. And the main reason I bought this plugin was for the editor. And given that I have all the source code, there's no... I should be able to extend this fairly well, or even reuse this same type of editor in other places. So we're just going to be adding our new text and relinking this up. So you see at the bottom there we have our if, where we set the true condition, and we also have our else, and those have, on the back end, they have connection slots so that we can map those back up. we just go ahead and hook back from our start back through the condition, and there I thought I was going to be able to. I'd meant to click the end connector, and I accidentally clicked the close. So give us a second here while past Chris goes ahead and re-adds that particular little set of dialogue. At this point, I was kind of admonishing the lack of any kind of copy paste or undo, common edit features in this editor. And then when I popped up the text, I realized it had the previous value that was last closed. But as we'll come back to shortly, that was actually a bug in the editor, and that text wasn't actually persisted to the dialog system. It was just an artifact of not clearing out the node when I brought it up. So yeah, I come back in here and I add an additional step so that after we get that first set of dialogue for the first time we talk to the NPC, we're going to go ahead and set that variable from within the editor. And then do the reconnection, making sure I don't accidentally close the node. And I keep resaving the editor using that save button because I haven't quite tested yet whether or not just using the normal Unity Control-S to save the project actually saves that dialogue or editor. But once the game loads, come back in here and we're going to see that our first bit of dialogue works, but then our second one is blank. And that's because of the bug I mentioned in the editor where it came up and showed the last entered text, but it isn't actually representative of what's in the system. It's just a UI. So presumably after that last save or when I actually ran the project, there was some kind of UI update that caused it to resync back to what's actually stored in the system. But either way, the fact that it showed the blank text proves that our condition worked. Our set variable actually set the variable appropriately, because the second time we came back through, we hit that other top node in the conversation. And then for all the subsequent times we talk to him, we get that second bit of dialogue. I believe at this point I'm contemplating what our next step is going to be, because quite frankly, I realized the video was only 7 minutes long or 8 minutes long or so. So it was way too short for a single one of my videos. If you've watched any of my past videos, you'll know I'm usually hitting the 40-minute to an hour and 40-minute mark. I would like to do shorter episodes, but I also want to break things up logically where it makes sense to stop. So as I'm working on larger features, the videos are inherently larger, but with a system like this, I can kind of break these up into much smaller pieces. Much smaller conceptual parts. So at this point, I'm figuring out that for the second example, I want to set a global variable from outside of the system, and I want to do something that's based on the player's actions. So we're going to add a mechanism that detects if the player has picked up a material 1 item, which is just another one of our mock items representing an upgrade material for the player's skill system and equipment. And we're going to set that variable from outside of the dialogger system and have the NPC add a condition check to the NPC dialog to see if that variable is true or false. And if it is, we'll have the NPC react to that. So, dialogger's static class, the main mechanism through which we're accessing the system has a series of set and get global variables functions, one for each data type. Very reminiscent of the Unity mechanism animation system, where we can do set boolean, set float, set trigger, set whatever. In this case, our options are only boolean, float, and string. Now, I kind of get a little unfortunate surprise here, because the dialogger methods that are exposed by the static class only want to deal with the variables in terms of their integer ID and not by the name of the variable, which means that we need to either have a correlation between the string name and the variable ID, or we just need to use the raw IDs everywhere. And sadly, unlike the NPC, or rather unlike the conversation names, it does not generate an enumeration based on that. Which, given that I have the source code, I'm sure it wouldn't be too much trouble to implement a similar function and create another enumeration type based on just whatever global variables are currently set in the system. Now, all of this does beget the question, what happens when I go to have multiple dialogger systems, or rather dialogger, so I don't know what the actual verbiage for that would be, but this set of conversations is going to be for this scene. If I'm loading in another, conversation set for a different scene I've loaded, does that mean the variables that are accessible are tied to that conversation set? And in addition, what happens to the enumerations? Is there a separate enumeration data type generated per conversation that we have added to the project, or do they all get collapsed together, or how does that work? Or can we only have one conversation set for the entire system? Which would be incredibly inflexible, because presumably when we load this up, it's all getting loaded into memory. And depending on the size of the project, that's a significant amount of data being pulled in. It makes sense to break that up and load it, on a per scene basis. You might have conversations loaded that for the characters that aren't even in the scene. So that's yet another thing we'll have to figure out if we're going to go ahead with this system. To be fair, given that I have the source code, I might end up needing to make some significant overhauls to this. And I do not know if this is an open source project, so I'm not sure if I would be committing those changes back. Obviously, since this is a sold product, I can't go and just release the code updates myself, because I'd be in violation of the license agreement. So, in the video here, I just, after meandering around for a few minutes trying to find an alternative, I just decided, all right, well, for the moment, we'll check if the item that's been added is that type, and we'll just set the variable based on the ID. And then I'll do some research a little bit later on down the line and see if there isn't a way to handle this gracefully. So we add our new global variable. It gets defaulted to false. And we'll pop back in here into the dialog editor. And we'll add a new condition to the front of the conversation. Now we'll check our hasMaterial1 variable if it's true or false, and if it's true, we're going to split off into a new bit of text. And I'm kind of pointing out here in the video that doesn't seem to be a concept of and or conditions in here. So if you wanted to get a composite condition, you would essentially seem to be needing to wire up multiple conditions to one another. And I think I also... I might have been talking over it about the previous point, but I also just noticed that the click events for each of the nodes doesn't actually interrupt the click from bubbling up. So if you have nodes that are on top of each other, the click events will affect the node that is underneath the top node, which is a bit of a problem. So we're adding our new text element. And wiring that up to our condition. And that's just going to result in an exit of the conversation. Now, obviously, it didn't work. The NPC continued with its original train of dialogue, even though we picked up the item. Those of you, the more observant members of my audience, might have noticed the error already, but in the code here, I'm accidentally returning before that secondary condition gets hit, which... To start with, I made sure I saved the editor, because like I said before, I'm not sure if the actual Unity save triggers the editor save. Chances are it doesn't. But we'll see, I pop back over to the code here for a second. When I overrode the method, it returns back immediately from the base.add item without actually... hitting that second bit of code where we set our global variable. And I noticed that in 3, 2, 1. And there we go. And when we come back in here, we're going to see that the system works as expected. After we pick up the material off the ground, our conversation tree changes to the second branch that we defined. And I think that about covers the content of this video. Trying to remember what I said I was going to do for the next part. I think for the next part we were going to implement the ability to choose dialog options and storing those in local and global variables. But we're going to need to do a little bit of finagling to our UI to get that to work. So anyways, that's all for this part. I hope you didn't mind the post commentary, and thank you for watching. Take care.